White slavery is a brutal chapter of history often brushed under the carpet. In the imagination of many, white people were always the oppressors and rarely the victims in history. This is not the case, as history is far more complex, and it was only in recent centuries that European nations came to dominate much of the world, and even then, various European groups suffered brutally in the process. Throughout centuries, untold numbers of European men, women and children were ripped from their homes, stripped of their identities and thrust into the dark, merciless world of slavery. This is their story, drenched in agony and suffering, and it demands to be told for the sake of understanding between humans. It is a story not commonly told because it does not suit the narratives of vested interests. In ancient Greece, slavery was an accepted institution. Greeks enslaved fellow Greeks as well as people from other regions. The Athenians, renowned for their democracy, hypocritically thrived on the labor of slaves who built their monuments and sustained their economy. These slaves endured harsh conditions with no rights or freedoms, serving masters who viewed them as mere property. Sparta relied heavily on enslaved helots and subjugated people from conquered regions. Helots endured brutal suppression and annual raids known as crypteia, where young Spartans would kill any helots deemed rebellious. Even intellectuals like Plato and Aristotle accepted slavery, with Aristotle stating, "For that some should rule and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient." Slaves in Athens worked in silver mines, enduring horrific conditions described by historian Xenophon, where the air was thick with dust and cries of suffering echoed through the tunnels. Household slaves had no rights and lived under constant threat of punishment. The grandeur of Greek achievements was built on a foundation of human misery. The institution of slavery, while enabling progress, was a dark stain on their legacy, a reality that must be acknowledged. The Romans, with their insatiable appetite for power and control, enslaved countless European tribes. Celtic, Germanic and Slavic people were hunted down like animals, their villages burned and their families torn apart. These slaves were nothing more than chattel, forced to build the empire's grandeur on the broken remains of their lives. Roman conquests brought millions into bondage, filling the empire with slaves from across Europe. In the silver mines of Spain, slaves laboured under unbearable conditions, shackled and driven by overseers in dark, dangerous tunnels. The historian Diodorus Siculus described these mines as places of death, where the air was thick with dust and the cries of the suffering echoed. In the Roman countryside, slaves worked on vast estates known as latifundia. They toiled from dawn to dusk, their lives marked by relentless labour and harsh punishments. The poet Horace wrote of these slaves, "They labour without hope, their bodies broken by the whip and the plough." Domestic slaves in Roman households faced constant abuse, with no rights or freedoms. They cooked, cleaned and attended to their master's every need, living under the constant threat of punishment. The philosopher Seneca observed, "A slave must endure every insult, he must submit to every command. He is indeed a man by nature, but he is a slave by fortune." The Roman economy depended heavily on slave labour. Slaves built monumental structures like the Colosseum and aqueducts, worked in workshops and factories, and supported the legions by building roads and fortifications. Their labour fueled the empire's expansion and prosperity, yet they remained unrecognised and unrewarded. The legacy of Rome's architectural and cultural achievements is tainted by the suffering and exploitation of these enslaved people. The grandeur of the Roman Empire, its towering structures and its celebrated civilization were built on a foundation of human misery. The transformation of Rome from a city of bricks to a city of marble came at an unimaginable human cost, paid with the blood, sweat and tears of countless enslaved individuals. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, North African Barbary pirates wreaked havoc along European coasts, snatching thousands of unsuspecting souls. Coastal villages in Italy, Spain, and even as far north as Iceland were ravaged. These pirates operated with ruthless efficiency, raiding coastal towns and capturing men, women and children. Thomas Pellow, a young English boy, was one such victim. He endured 23 years of hellish captivity, brutalized, starved and beaten. His story stands out among many, a testament to the unimaginable cruelty these slaves faced. Enslaved as a child, Pellow was subjected to relentless beatings, forced labor and the constant threat of death. The pirates' cruelty knew no bounds. They mutilated, tortured and killed without a second thought. The captured victims were chained, beaten, and crammed into the dark, filthy holds of ships, enduring weeks of inhumane conditions before being sold like livestock in North African markets. Slaves endured back-breaking labour in quarries and fields, and as galley slaves rowing until their bodies gave out. The weak and the sick were left to die, their bodies discarded like trash. Slaves were stripped of their identities, branded like cattle. and forced to change their faith under threat of death. Families were torn apart, with children sold off and women subjected to sexual slavery. The pirates had no regard for human life, viewing their captives as mere commodities to be exploited and discarded. The Barbary pirates created a reign of terror along the European coasts. They raided at will, snatching and enslaving people from their homes and communities, leaving devastation in their wake. The captives were subjected to a life of relentless suffering and dehumanization, their spirits crushed under the weight of their bondage. In the early 19th century, the United States, tired of the constant threat and extortion by the Barbary pirates, decided to take action. The First Barbary War, from 1801 to 1805, marked America's first significant military engagement overseas. Under President Thomas Jefferson's orders, the U.S. Navy was deployed to the Mediterranean to confront the pirates. The conflict culminated in a daring assault on the pirate stronghold of Tripoli, famously led by Lieutenant Stephen Decatur. The American forces' bravery and determination forced the Barbary states to negotiate, leading to a temporary cessation of pirate attacks on American ships. However, the respite was short-lived. The Barbary pirates resumed their activities, leading to the Second Barbary War in 1815. This time, under President James Madison, the United States launched a more decisive campaign. Commodore Stephen Decatur led a powerful squadron to the shores of North Africa, delivering a series of crushing defeats to the pirate fleets. The American victories compelled the rulers of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli to sign treaties renouncing piracy and releasing American prisoners. The United States intervention was a significant turning point, showcasing the resolve and growing power of the young nation. The Barbary Wars not only secured the safety of American shipping, but also sent a strong message against the scourge of piracy and slavery. The legacy of these wars remains a testament to the fight against oppression and the relentless pursuit of freedom. The Ottoman Empire systematically kidnapped and enslaved many Europeans. Many of these enslaved people were forced to work as domestic servants, sex slaves, and soldiers. Torn from their families, many boys were brainwashed, brutalized, and molded into fierce soldiers called janissaries with a loyalty forged in pain and blood. They were stripped of their faith, their names, and their humanity. Boys, often as young as 7, were forcefully taken from their homes, marched in chains to distant lands, and compelled to convert to Islam. The transformation was brutal. The Devshirme, or blood tax, demanded that these boys abandon their pasts. Once they became janissaries, they underwent harsh and rigorous training designed to break their spirits and reshape them into instruments of war. Janissaries were subjected to relentless drilling and severe punishments. They lived lives devoid of personal freedom, forbidden to marry, and denied the comfort of family. Their existence was one of perpetual violence, and loyalty enforced through fear and brutality. Historical records reveal the deep anguish of these boys, who were treated as expendable, thrown into the fiercest battles, and punished mercilessly for any sign of defiance. One poignant account comes from Konstantin Mihailovich, a Serbian janissary who later escaped and wrote about his experiences. He described the relentless beatings, the psychological torment, and the erasure of his identity. We were made to forget our names, our families, our faith. We were no longer who we once were. We became shadows of our former selves, living only to serve. The training of janissaries was as brutal as it was effective. They were isolated from the outside world, kept under constant surveillance, and subjected to a rigid, militarized lifestyle. This environment of fear and discipline was intended to ensure absolute obedience. Failure to comply was met with severe punishment, often death. The historian Douglas Howard notes, the janissaries' training was designed to instill fear and obedience. It was a system that thrived on breaking the human spirit. The janissaries' military prowess was unmatched, but their personal lives were a sacrifice to the empire's ambitions. Forbidden to marry, they were expected to dedicate their entire existence to the state. This lifelong celibacy was another method to ensure their complete dependency and loyalty to the Sultan. Despite their elite status, the janissaries were often viewed with a mix of fear and disdain by the Ottoman populace. They were a formidable force, but their power came at the cost of their humanity. Their rebellion in the 17th century, known as the Auspicious Incident, highlighted the inherent tension within this system. The janissaries, tired of their brutal treatment and harsh conditions, revolted against the Sultan, leading to a bloody crackdown and the eventual dissolution of their corps. The Devshirme system did not solely create soldiers. Captured Europeans were also trained to serve in various administrative and bureaucratic roles within the empire. These boys, once stripped of their identities, were groomed to become loyal civil servants, filling the ranks of the empire's vast administrative machine. They became scribes, accountants, and high-ranking officials, ensuring the smooth running of the Ottoman state. This exploitation extended to utilizing their talents and skills for the empire's benefit, regardless of their original identities. In addition to soldiers and administrators, some captured boys were selected for their intelligence and potential to be educated in the finest Ottoman schools. These individuals often rose to prominent positions within the government, influencing policies and governance. The system was designed to cultivate a loyal class of officials who owed their status and success entirely to the Sultan. Many captives were placed into the service of the palace, working as servants or eunuchs in the Sultan's court. These roles, though not as physically demanding as those of the janissaries, were marked by a different kind of servitude and control, as they were constantly monitored and manipulated to ensure their loyalty. The Devshirme system also included the capture of young European girls and women who faced a particularly harrowing fate. Many of these girls were forced into brothels, where they were subjected to sexual exploitation and abuse. These brothels, often part of the empire's extensive network of sex slavery, were places of unimaginable suffering. The girls, torn from their homes and stripped of their dignity, endured relentless abuse, their lives reduced to a cycle of violence and exploitation. The legacy of the janissaries and other enslaved individuals under the Devshirme system is a dark chapter in the history of the Ottoman Empire. Their story is a stark reminder of the extreme measures taken by empires to maintain power and control. The Devshirme system, with its calculated brutality, turned Europeans' children into warriors, administrators and servants, stripping them of their identities and molding them into tools of the state. Their lives, filled with relentless suffering and manipulation, underscore the human cost of such ruthless systems. The anguish and pain endured by these boys and girls are a haunting testament to the depths of human cruelty and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Vikings, the terror of medieval Europe, raided coastal and inland areas, capturing thousands of Europeans. The British Isles, Ireland and Eastern Europe were prime targets, their people enslaved and transported to distant lands. Captured individuals were shackled, marched to Viking ships and packed like sardines in appalling conditions. Many died from disease and malnutrition before even reaching their destination. Enslaved people in Viking settlements were subjected to unending toil, their bodies broken by relentless labour. They were treated as property with no rights, no hope and no future. The legacy of Viking slavery left deep scars on the affected regions. Communities were decimated, cultures disrupted, and countless lives ruined. Arab raiders captured Europeans during raids, often targeting Mediterranean coastal regions. These victims were sold in bustling slave markets in Baghdad, Cairo, and other major cities. Slave markets were scenes of human misery, where people were auctioned like commodities. Families were torn apart, with children and adults sold to the highest bidder. Accounts from European slaves in the Arab world reveal a life of constant suffering. Many were subjected to hard labor, forced to convert, and stripped of their cultural identities. Slaves endured relentless physical and psychological abuse. Women were often forced into harems, enduring sexual exploitation, while men faced grueling labor and harsh punishments. The Crimean Khanate was notorious for its raids into Eastern Europe, capturing thousands of Russians, Poles, and Ukrainians. These slaves were transported to Crimea and sold across the Ottoman Empire. The slave markets of Crimea were brutal places where human lives were traded for profit. The Crimean Tatars conducted frequent raids, known as harvesting the steppe, capturing villagers and selling them into slavery. One notable example is the account of Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Hrushevsky, who documented the extensive slave raids and the harrowing experiences of those captured. Slaves were often subjected to forced labor, with many never seeing their homeland again. Slaves endured grueling conditions with little hope of escape. They were often used as concubines, soldiers, or laborers, their identities erased and their lives controlled by their masters. The English enslaved thousands of Irish during the 17th century, a dark and brutal period marked by unimaginable suffering and cruelty. Oliver Cromwell's conquest of Ireland was particularly savage, resulting in widespread death, displacement, and enslavement. Cromwell, with his Puritan zeal and unyielding hatred for the Irish Catholics, waged a campaign of terror across the land. Following the siege of Drogheda in 1649, Cromwell's forces massacred thousands of Irish soldiers and civilians. This was just the beginning of a reign of terror that saw entire communities destroyed and survivors subjected to a life of torment. Cromwell's conquest led to the systematic enslavement and transportation of Irish people to the Caribbean. They were sold as indentured servants, but the term indentured barely conceals the reality of their conditions. These men, women and children were treated no better than slaves. Those who were transported faced a brutal journey across the Atlantic. Crammed into filthy, disease-ridden ships, many did not survive the passage. The stench of death was ever present, and the cries of the sick and dying echoed through the holds. Upon arrival in the Caribbean, the Irish were sold at auction, stripped of their humanity and dignity. They were forced to labour in the blistering heat of the sugar plantations, enduring backbreaking work from dawn until dusk. The overseers, armed with whips and driven by greed, showed no mercy. Slaves who faltered under the relentless sun were beaten, sometimes to death, their bodies discarded like refuse. The conditions on the plantations were horrific. The Irish slaves lived in squalid huts, plagued by disease and malnutrition. They were given barely enough food to survive, and what little they had was often spoiled or infested. The plantation owners viewed them as expendable, mere tools to be worked to exhaustion and replaced. The punishments for disobedience or perceived slights were severe. Whippings, brandings, and mutilations were commonplace. A slave who attempted to escape could expect to be hunted down and subjected to even more brutal retribution. The overseers took sadistic pleasure in breaking the spirits of their captives, using fear and pain to maintain control. Women and children were not spared the horrors of this existence. Women were often subjected to sexual exploitation, forced into relationships with their masters or overseers. Their children, born into bondage, knew no other life but one of suffering and labour. Families were torn apart, with members sold off to different plantations, never to see each other again. In Russia, serfdom closely resembled slavery. Serfs were bound to the land and their lords, forced to work under harsh conditions. The reign of Tsar Ivan the Terrible saw brutal repression and the expansion of serfdom. Ivan IV, known for his ruthlessness, implemented policies that deepened the bonds of serfdom, reducing peasants to mere property of the nobility. Russian serfs endured grueling labour, oppressive taxes and brutal punishments. Serfs lived in abject poverty, with little hope for freedom. They were subjected to corporal punishment, forced labour and exploitation, their lives controlled by the whims of their lords. The nobility wielded absolute power over the serfs, dictating every aspect of their existence. Serfs were often beaten for minor infractions, and their bodies bore the scars of their masters' cruelty. The historian Vasily Kluchevsky described the plight of serfs. They toiled from dawn till dusk, their sweat and blood fertilizing the fields they did not own. The introduction of the Sobornoye Ulozhenie in 1649 by Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich further entrenched serfdom, legally binding peasants to the land and solidifying their status as the property of their landlords. This law ensured that serfs could be bought, sold and traded at the will of their owners, much like livestock. They were forced to endure back-breaking labour in the fields, forests and mines, with no rights or means of escape. The lives of Russian serfs were marked by relentless toil and suffering. They were expected to produce crops, tend to livestock, and maintain the estates of their lords. Failure to meet the impossible demands often resulted in severe punishment or even death. Serfs were also subjected to heavy taxes, further impoverishing them and ensuring their perpetual indebtedness and dependency. During the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, many Circassians and other Europeans were captured and enslaved. These slaves were trained as soldiers and administrators, known as Mamluks. The Mamluks rose to significant power in Egypt, but their rise was built on a foundation of brutal training and harsh conditions. Captured as children, their identities were erased, and their lives dedicated to serving the Sultan. The Mamluks endured rigorous military training, often under brutal conditions. They were stripped of their past and moulded into elite warriors, their lives dictated by the Sultan's demands. The training was designed to break their spirits and ensure absolute loyalty. The Mamluks were subjected to severe discipline and constant surveillance, their every move controlled by their masters. The historian Al-Makrizi noted, the Mamluks were like clay in the hands of the potter, shaped and reshaped until they became perfect instruments of war. The Mamluks' rise to power came at a great personal cost. Despite their elite status, they were still slaves, their lives bound by the whims of the Sultan. They were expected to display unwavering loyalty and obedience, their worth measured by their martial prowess and ability to serve the state. The Mamluks were frequently sent into the most dangerous battles, their lives expendable in the pursuit of the Sultan's ambitions. Many Mamluks held high administrative positions, governing provinces and commanding armies. Their influence in Egypt grew, but their power was always overshadowed by the harsh realities of their origins. They could be executed or demoted at the Sultan's whim, their fortunes tied to the volatile politics of the court. The Mamluk story is one of paradox and tragedy. They were both powerful and powerless, elite warriors and slaves. Their identities were stripped away, their lives forged in brutality and discipline. The legacy of the Mamluks is a stark reminder of the complex interplay between power and subjugation, highlighting the human cost of the relentless pursuit of dominance. Slaves were subjected to relentless physical abuse, beatings, starvation, and backbreaking labor. The scars of chains, whips, and branding irons marked their bodies as property, a constant reminder of their brutal existence. The psychological torment was equally devastating. Slaves were cut off from their families, their cultures erased, and their identities obliterated. The constant threat of violence and the loss of hope drove many to the brink of madness. The dehumanization of slaves was systematic and relentless. They were denied basic rights, forced to adopt new religions and languages, and treated as subhuman. The dehumanizing treatment stripped away their dignity, leaving them as mere shadows of their former selves. This is the brutal, unvarnished truth about white slavery, a chapter of human history drenched in blood and suffering. These victims, ripped from their homes and lives, endured unimaginable horrors. Their stories must be told, remembered, and acknowledged, lest we forget the depths of human cruelty and the enduring strength of the human spirit. We must confront this dark history and ensure it is never forgotten. Share this video, discuss these stories, and reflect on the broader implications of slavery and human rights. Subscribe to this channel for more hard-hitting historical truths, and join us in the fight to keep these memories alive.